I followed the developments with the Soviet Union and Europe and America with more than just a little interest, having worked in the Reagan White House. I went from one side of the Atlantic to the other, but with a keen interest in seeing what President Reagan was doing and how he was responding to these changing conditions in the Soviet Union. There was a succession of a number of their leaders dying, and finally it ends with Gorbachev when the door stops swinging. He wanted change in the Soviet Union. He didn't intend to get rid of the communist system or Marxism, but he was willing to give a little bit of breathing room to people who thought differently. Well, people in a country where everything belongs to everybody, therefore it belongs to nobody, tend not to be as productive. If you don't get rewarded in your work with some kind of incentive for what you do, it tends not to be taken as seriously. Well, multiply this times several million, and you have a country where projects are started and they're not completed. They stand around half the day smoking cigarettes because missing parts had impeded production. And it was just very difficult for an economy that was running that way to ever really be very successful. So, Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to restructure the economy so it would function better. At the same time, he is arming to the teeth, one might say. There is an arms race that had been going on with really a lot of heat during the 80s, and as the Soviets are stationing their SS-20s in Europe, America is then stationing the Pershing missiles in response. So Reagan was essentially pursuing a two-pronged strategy. One was to continue to arm the West, including NATO countries, but at the same time have serious talks with Gorbachev to do away with an entire classification of armaments. And Gorbachev could see that that would really be to the advantage of Russia because they were spending so much to try to keep up. About the time that President Reagan introduces the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, it would be a shield whereby the United States could shoot down missiles coming in from any other country. Well, it seemed like a very attractive kind of option to the United States, and the Russians didn't like that at all because it would mean whatever they were shooting from wherever it might be, that they had no chance of success. So there's a conflict going on, and both countries are spending a great deal of money in this arms race, but the Soviets are having a harder time sustaining it because their economy was already much weaker than they wanted it to be. When President Reagan comes to Berlin in 1985, the Brandenburg Gate is right behind him, and he's looking into the east. He's saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Well, this was an unscripted proclamation on his part, and it resonated across all of Europe and on both sides of the Atlantic. He meant it, and yet people were looking at that, but that's ludicrous. That was a throwaway line. What could he possibly mean by that? Well, Reagan meant it altogether. And no one there, and I can tell you having lived in Germany at that time, no one could have imagined that 4 years later, the Berlin Wall would be opened.